"Pack your bags and don't come back," my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm, almost bored, as if she were asking me to pass the salt instead of erasing me from my own son's life. My son had been gone for exactly 6 days. 6 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket under a gray sky, gripping a folded tissue while people I barely recognized told me how strong I was. 6 days since Daniel, my only child, my anchor, was lowered into the ground, taking half of my world with him. And now I was sitting at the same dining table where I had served him birthday cakes and Sunday roasts for over 40 years, being told I no longer belonged. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked down at my plate, at the food I hadn't touched, and noticed how steady my hands were. That was the first thing that surprised me. Not the cruelty of her words. Not the silence from anyone else in the room. Just the fact that my hands didn't shake. Ashley leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with a small sigh. Like this conversation was an inconvenience she needed to get through. "This house was never really yours," she added, softer this time, but sharper somehow. I nodded once, as if I understood. As if any of this made sense. Around us, the house felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same framed photos of Daniel smiling in a baseball cap or standing beside me at Christmas, but everything felt hollow, like a stage set after the actors had left. I could still smell his cologne faintly in the hallway upstairs. I could still picture him leaning against the kitchen counter, telling me not to worry so much about things that didn't matter. "You'll always have a place here, Mom," he used to say. Always. It's funny how quickly that word can disappear. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair in with care, as if the smallest sound might break something fragile in the air. Ashley didn't look at me. She had already picked up her phone, her attention shifting elsewhere, as though I had already become invisible. I walked upstairs to the bedroom I had been using since Daniel insisted I move in after my hip surgery 2 years ago. My suitcase was still in the closet from the last time I thought I might need it, tucked behind winter coats and a box of old photo albums. I pulled it out without rushing, folded my clothes neatly, chose only what I needed. Each movement was deliberate, quiet, controlled. When I passed the mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself, silver hair pulled back, blue eyes steady, face lined with years but not broken. Not yet. That night, I left without saying goodbye. The air outside was colder than I expected, sharp against my skin as I placed my suitcase in the trunk of my old sedan. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to, because somewhere deep inside me, beneath the grief and the shock and the quiet humiliation, something else had begun to settle into place. And the next morning, instead of searching for somewhere to disappear, I drove straight to the bank. I had not driven myself to the bank in years. Daniel used to insist on coming with me, saying it was easier if he handled the paperwork, that I did not need to worry about things like routing numbers and account statements. That morning, as I pulled into the parking lot just after 9 o'clock, the sun was already high, casting long reflections across the glass doors, and for a moment I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet hum of the engine. It felt unfamiliar, not being accompanied, not having someone reach over and say, "I will take care of it, Mom." But then I turned off the car, picked up my purse, and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying that early fall chill that settles into your bones if you stand still too long. Inside, the bank looked exactly as I remembered. The same polished floors, the same muted voices, the same faint scent of paper and coffee. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that is trained rather than felt, and asked how she could help. "I would like to review my accounts," I said, hearing the steadiness in my own voice again. She nodded and led me to a desk near the back where a woman in her 50s introduced herself as Karen, a financial manager. She offered her condolences when I mentioned my son, her tone soft and practiced, but there was a sincerity in her eyes that I appreciated. "Let us take a look at everything together," she said, turning her screen toward me. I handed over my identification and the small folder of documents I had brought, most of them older than the building we were sitting in. As she typed, I watched the numbers appear on the screen, columns and rows that meant very little to me at first glance. "You have your primary checking account here," she said, pointing, "and a savings account jointly held." That part one expected. Daniel had set those up years ago. But then her brow furrowed slightly, and she leaned closer to the monitor. "There are additional accounts listed under your name," she continued, slower now. as if choosing each word carefully. Certificates of deposit, a money market account, and she paused, clicking again. A trust. The word hung in the air between us. A trust. I repeated, the syllables unfamiliar on my tongue. Karen nodded. Yes, ma'am. It appears to have been established about 4 years ago. 4 years ago. That was around the time Daniel had started asking me to sign things during our visits here, always telling me it was routine, that it was easier if everything was organized. I had trusted him completely. I still did. Can you show me? I asked. She printed out several pages, sliding them across the desk toward me. The numbers were larger than I expected, larger than anything I had ever personally managed. My name appeared again and again, typed neatly at the top of each document, as if someone had been preparing something carefully, quietly, over time. Mrs. Collins, Karen said gently, based on what I am seeing, these assets are solely under your control. Solely under my control. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked down at the papers, my fingers tracing the ink as if it might disappear if I did not hold on to it. Outside, cars passed by in the parking lot, people going about their ordinary mornings, unaware that in this small office, my entire understanding of my situation had just shifted. Daniel had not left me unprotected. He had not left me at anyone's mercy. He had been planning something, piece by piece, making sure that even in his absence, I would not be as powerless as they believed. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt something other than grief settle into my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something steadier. Understanding. I did not leave the bank right away. I sat there across from Karen, the papers spread neatly in front of me, and for a long moment, I simply looked at my own name repeated across each page as if I were seeing it for the first time. Margaret Collins. It felt strange, almost distant, like it belonged to someone who had been quietly living a life I had not fully understood. Would you like me to explain how the trust works? Karen asked, her voice gentle but precise. I nodded. She turned one of the documents toward me and began outlining the structure, her finger tracing lines of text that suddenly carried more weight than anything I had heard in weeks. The trust, she explained, had been designed to protect assets from external control. It listed me as the sole beneficiary and primary decision-maker. There were clauses about property, accounts, and access permissions, all carefully arranged to ensure that no one else could override my authority without my consent. No one else. I let that phrase settle in. Your son was very thorough, she added, almost as an afterthought. Thorough. That was a word that fit Daniel. He had always been the kind of person who double-checked things, who read the fine print, who asked questions even when everyone else was ready to sign and move on. I remembered the way he used to sit at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand, reviewing documents late into the evening, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. Back then, I thought he was just being careful. Now, I understood he had been preparing. There is also a property deed associated with this trust, Karen continued, pulling up another file on her screen. The primary residence is listed here. My heart gave a small, unexpected shift. The house. I asked quietly. She nodded. Yes, ma'am. According to this, ownership was transferred into the trust structure. That means any decisions regarding the property would require your authorization. For a moment, the room seemed to grow very still. The same house I had walked out of the night before with a single suitcase. The same house where I had been told I did not belong. I folded my hands together. In my lap, feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something real. And no one else can make changes? I asked. Not without you, Karen said. Her tone was calm, certain. Not without you. I thought about Ashley standing in that dining room, her voice steady as she told me to leave, as if everything had already been decided. I thought about the quiet confidence in her posture, the way she had spoken like someone who believed the outcome was already hers. She did not know. That realization did not come with satisfaction or triumph. Not yet. It came with clarity, a kind of quiet alignment of facts that had been scattered before. Daniel had known something, or perhaps he had simply understood people better than I gave him credit for. Either way, he had made sure I would not be erased. Would you like to speak with an attorney to review everything in more detail? Karen asked. I considered the question carefully. Outside the window, a man walked past carrying a coffee cup, his pace unhurried, his expression neutral. Life continuing, as it always does, regardless of who is left behind. Yes, I said finally, my voice even. I think that would be wise. Karen gave a small nod and began making arrangements, her movements efficient, practiced. As she worked, I gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning the edges with care. Each page felt less like a surprise now and more like a message. Not a loud one, not dramatic, just deliberate. And as I stood up to leave, holding that folder in my hands, I realized something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I had walked into the bank as someone who had been told she no longer had a place. I was walking out with the quiet understanding that I still did. I just had not known where to look. The drive away from the bank felt different than the drive there. The same streets, the same traffic lights, the same familiar storefronts I had passed for years, but everything seemed sharper, more defined, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a lens I did not realize had been blurred. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, its presence steady and undeniable. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. There was no one I needed to explain this to. Not yet. Instead, I let my mind move backward, retracing moments that had once seemed ordinary but now carried a different weight. I thought about the afternoon Daniel had asked me to come with him to the bank, insisting it would only take a few minutes. I remembered sitting in a chair much like the one I had just left, signing forms he placed gently in front of me, trusting his quiet assurance that it was all routine. Just updates, Mom, he had said, offering that small, reassuring smile he had worn since he was a boy, trying to convince me he had finished his homework. I had not questioned him. I had never needed to. Trust, once given that freely, does not come with conditions. But now, those memories shifted, revealing something else beneath them. The way he had watched me sign, attentive but calm. The way he had thanked me afterward, not casually, but with a softness that lingered just a second longer than usual. At the time, I thought it was simply kindness. Now, I understood it might have been something closer to certainty. He had been putting things in place. Not in a dramatic way. Not with urgency or fear. Just carefully, deliberately, as if he were arranging pieces on a board no one else could see. I stopped at a red light and glanced down at the folder beside me. The edges were perfectly aligned, the papers inside organized with a precision that felt unmistakably his. Daniel had always believed in preparation. Even as a child, he packed his school bag the night before, laid out his clothes, checked his work twice. It was a habit that followed him into adulthood, into business decisions, into the way he managed everything that mattered, including me. The light turned green, and I continued driving, my thoughts settling into a quieter rhythm. I realized then that what I had discovered was not sudden. It was not something that appeared out of nowhere to save me at the last moment. It had been there all along, built quietly over time, waiting for a moment I never expected to face. That realization did not bring comfort in the way I might have hoped. It brought clarity, and clarity has a way of changing how you see everything else. By the time I pulled into the small parking lot of the extended stay hotel I had chosen the night before, the sun had begun to dip slightly in the sky, casting a softer light across the building. It was not home, not in the way I had defined it for most of my life. But as I turned off the engine and reached for the folder, I did not feel displaced in the same way I had the night before. I stepped out of the car, the cool air brushing against my face, and for the first time since Daniel's funeral, I did not feel like I was standing at the edge of something empty. I felt like I was standing at the beginning of something I had not yet fully understood. And somewhere beneath that quiet realization, another thought settled in, steady and unspoken. They believed I had nothing left. They believed I had nowhere to go. And they had no idea how wrong they were. The hotel room was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not empty, but contained, as if the world had been reduced to a smaller space where every sound mattered. The hum of the air conditioner, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the soft rustle of paper as I placed the folder on the small desk near the window. I did not unpack right away. Instead, I sat down in the chair, rested my hands on the table, and looked at the documents again, slower this time, more carefully. Each line, each signature, each detail carried intention. Daniel had not rushed any of this. He had thought it through, step by step, making sure there would be no gaps, no misunderstandings, no room for anyone else to reinterpret what he had decided. I traced my name again with my finger, then his, printed neatly in places where it needed to be, like a quiet confirmation that this was real, that this had been planned long before I ever imagined needing it. There was a section I had not fully absorbed at the bank, something Karen had mentioned briefly but had not explained in detail. A clause regarding management authority. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer, reading each word slowly, allowing it to settle into place. The trust did not simply protect assets. It gave me control over how they were used, how they were accessed, and most importantly, who could be denied access. The wording was clear, precise, final. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a breath I had not realized I was holding. For the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself to think about Ashley not as someone in control, but as someone who had been operating under an assumption that everything belonged to her now, that I was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed. The quiet confidence in her voice, the way she had already begun rearranging the house, speaking about it as if decisions had already been made. It all made sense now, but not in the way she believed. My eyes moved back to the papers, to the structure Daniel had built, and I began to see the full shape of it. This was not just protection. It was intention. He had anticipated a situation where I might need to stand alone, and he had made sure I would not be powerless when that moment came. I stood up and walked toward the window, pulling the curtains slightly aside. The parking lot below was half full, a few people coming and going, carrying bags, talking on their phones, living lives that had nothing to do with mine. The ordinariness of it grounded me. Nothing about the world had changed. Only my understanding of it had. I returned to the desk and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number Karen had written down for the attorney. I did not hesitate. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing on the other end. When the voice answered, calm and professional, I introduced myself without rushing, without explaining more than necessary. "My name is Margaret Collins," I said. "I believe my son arranged for me to speak with you." There was a brief pause, followed by a shift in tone, something more attentive, more aware. "Yes, Mrs. Collins," the man replied. "I have been expecting your call." Expecting. The words settled into place, just like everything else had been settling all day. Daniel had not left anything unfinished. Not even this. I scheduled the appointment for the following morning, thanked him, and ended the call. Then I placed the phone back on the table and looked once more at the documents in front of me. The situation had not changed outwardly. I was still in a hotel room. I still had a suitcase with only a few days' worth of clothes. I had still been told to leave the only home I had known for years. But something fundamental had shifted beneath all of that. The balance had changed. And this time, I understood exactly where I stood. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, but I woke before the alarm anyway. For a few seconds, I did not recognize where I was. The ceiling was unfamiliar, the light filtering through the curtains softer than the sunlight that used to fill Daniel's house. Then it settled back into place. The hotel room, the folder on the desk, the call I had made the night before. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the carpet, grounding myself in the present before standing. There was no hesitation in my movements. No rushing either. Just a steady rhythm, the kind that comes when the next step is already clear. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blouse and a light gray jacket, something that felt appropriate but not performative. I was not going to plead my case. I was going to understand it. The law office was located downtown, in a building with tall windows and polished stone floors that reflected each step as I walked in. The receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to wait, her tone professional but not distant. I sat in a chair near the window, the folder resting on my lap, my hands folded over it. People moved through the space with purpose, voices low, conversations measured. It was a place where decisions were made quietly, but carried weight. After a few minutes, a man approached, extending his hand. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice calm and assured. "I am Thomas Reed. Your son spoke very highly of you." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip, the steadiness in his eyes. "Thank you," I replied. He always spoke well of others. There was a brief pause, something unspoken passing between us, before he gestured toward his office. Inside, the room was simple but organized, shelves lined with files, a large desk positioned near the window. He waited until I was seated before taking his place across from me. I understand you visited the bank yesterday, he began. I nodded and placed the folder on the desk, sliding it toward him. They told me my son arranged certain things, I said. I would like to understand exactly what those things are. He opened the folder and began reviewing the documents with a practiced eye, scanning quickly at first, then more slowly, as if confirming details he already expected to find. Your son was very deliberate, he said after a moment. He structured this trust in a way that gives you full authority over all associated assets, including the residence. The word residence carried a quiet emphasis, and no one else has decision-making power. I asked. He looked up at me directly. No, ma'am. Not unless you choose to grant it. I let that settle, the clarity of it leaving no room for interpretation. There is something else, he continued, turning a page. There are protective provisions written into this trust. They specifically prevent any forced sale or transfer of property without your explicit approval. Forced sale. The phrase aligned with something I had not said out loud, but had already begun to suspect. He anticipated pressure, I said quietly. Thomas Reed nodded once. It would appear so. I sat back slightly, absorbing the weight of that understanding. Daniel had not only protected me, he had anticipated a situation where protection would be necessary. What happens if someone attempts to act without my authorization? I asked. His expression remained composed. Their actions would be legally invalid, he said, and we would be able to intervene immediately. Immediately. The word carried a quiet certainty that matched everything else I had learned. I looked down at the documents once more, then back at him. I would like to make sure everything is secured, I said. Every account, every access point. He gave a small, approving nod. Of course, we can begin that process today. As he outlined the next steps, the language precise and methodical, I listened carefully, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but focused. This was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what had never been theirs to take. And as I sat there, in that quiet office, with the details of my situation laid out clearly in front of me, I realized something that had not fully formed. Until that moment, I was not reacting anymore. I was preparing. The rest of that morning moved with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I were stepping into a version of myself I had not needed to be before. Thomas Reed handled each step methodically, explaining what would be secured first, what would be restricted, and what would be monitored moving forward. I listened without interruption, asking only the questions that mattered, the ones that clarified rather than repeated. By the time I left his office, the process had already begun. Notifications had been sent. Access points had been flagged. Accounts that once felt distant and undefined were now clearly within my control. Nothing visible had changed yet, but the structure beneath everything had shifted. That afternoon, I returned to the hotel and sat by the window, watching the slow rhythm of people moving through their day. There was no urgency in me. No need to act quickly or prove anything. For the first time since that dinner, I understood that time was not working against me. It was working with me. I did not reach out to Ashley. I did not call or send a message. Silence, I realized, was not weakness. It was space. And in that space, things began to reveal themselves. It did not take long. The call came just after 3 o'clock. I recognized the number immediately, though I had not expected it so soon. I let it ring once more before answering. Hello, I said, my voice even. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by Ashley's voice, sharper than usual, stripped of the calm confidence she had carried the night before. Margaret, I need to ask you something, she said. Not hello, not how are you. Straight to need. I said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for her to continue. I was speaking with someone about the house, she went on, her tone tightening, and there seems to be some confusion about ownership. Confusion. The words settled between us, fragile and revealing. Is there? I replied quietly. Another pause. This one longer. They said there are restrictions, she continued, her voice now carefully controlled, as if choosing each word with effort. That decisions cannot be made without your approval. I looked out the window, watching a car pull into the parking lot below. The driver stepping out with a cup of coffee in hand, unaware of the shift taking place in a conversation several floors above. That sounds accurate, I said. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was tense. I could almost hear her recalculating, adjusting the version of reality she had been operating under. Why was I not informed about this? She asked, and this time there was something else beneath the question. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to unease. I considered the question, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood the weight of how it would land. It was not your arrangement to be informed about, I said. Calm. Direct. No edge, no accusation. Just fact. She exhaled softly, a sound that carried more than words could. We need to talk about this, she said quickly, the urgency now clearer. There are plans that need to be discussed. Plans. The word echoed faintly, but it no longer held the same power it had before. I agree, I said. We should discuss it. Another pause, shorter this time. When can you come by? She asked. I let a moment pass, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Tomorrow, I said. Late morning. Fine, she replied, too quickly, as if eager to regain control of something that was already shifting beyond her reach. The call ended without another word. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the table beside me, and allowed the quiet of the room to return. Nothing had been raised. No voices had been lifted. No confrontation had taken place. And yet everything had changed. The assumption she had built her certainty on was beginning to unravel, not through force, but through fact. I remained seated for a while, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my posture relaxed but steady. Tomorrow would not be about proving anything. It would simply be about stating what had always been true. And this time, I would not be the one asked to leave. The next morning, I did not rush. I woke at the same steady pace, dressed with the same quiet care, and gathered the folder from the desk as if it had always belonged in my hands. The drive back to the house felt shorter than I remembered, though the distance had not changed. Familiar streets unfolded one after another, each turn bringing me closer to a place that had once been mine without question. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it had the day I left. The same white siding, the same trimmed hedges, the same front porch where Daniel used to sit in the evenings with a cup of coffee. Nothing on the outside reflected what had shifted beneath it. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet morning air. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking in the stillness. Then I walked to the front door and rang the bell. I did not use my key. I did not let myself in. I waited. It did not take long. The door opened, and Ashley stood there, her expression composed but tighter than before, her posture carefully held as if she were bracing for something she could not yet define. You are early, she said. I glanced at the clock on the wall behind her. It is 10 minutes before 11, I replied. That is not early. She stepped aside without responding, allowing me to enter. The air inside felt familiar, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a tension now, subtle but present, like a room that had been rearranged but not settled. I walked into the living room and took a seat without being invited, placing the folder on my lap. Ashley remained standing for a moment before sitting across from me, her movements controlled, deliberate. I spoke with someone yesterday, she began, her tone measured. They told me there are legal complications regarding the house and certain accounts. I nodded once. That is correct. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching my face as if trying to read something that was no longer there. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she continued. Daniel and I shared everything. His assets, his decisions, his plans. It would not make sense for him to exclude me from something this significant. I listened without interrupting, letting her words settle into the space between us. When she finished, I opened the folder slowly and placed a single document on the table, turning it toward her. There is no misunderstanding, I said. She looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning the lines, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly with each word. I did not explain it. I did not guide her through it. I allowed her to see it for herself. The structure, the authority, the clarity of Daniel's decisions. The silence stretched longer this time, heavier, filled with the quiet realization that something she had assumed was hers had never been. This does not make sense, she said finally, her voice lower now, less certain. I folded my hands calmly. It does, I replied. You just were not aware of it. She looked up at me then, really looked, as if seeing me differently for the first time. Not as someone who had been asked to leave, but as someone who had returned with something she could not dismiss. We need to figure out what this means moving forward, she said, her tone shifting again, searching for ground that no longer felt stable. I inclined my head slightly. "We will," I said, "but not based on assumptions." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not empty. It was defined, clear, and for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I was no longer standing on uncertain ground. I was exactly where I needed to be. She did not touch the document again after that. It remained on the table between us, angled slightly toward her, as if it belonged more to her realization than to my explanation. The room held a stillness that felt different from before, no longer uncertain, but settled in a way that left little room for interpretation. Ashley leaned back slowly, her fingers pressing together in her lap, her gaze no longer searching for an argument, but for something else entirely, something that had already begun to slip beyond her reach. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Stripped of the sharp edge it had carried the night she told me to leave. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I let the question rest in the space between us, giving it the weight it deserved. Then I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that did not require repetition. "I am saying that nothing here has changed except your understanding of it." Her eyes flickered, the meaning settling in slowly, piece by piece, just as it had for me. "The house," she said, almost to herself. "The accounts," I inclined my head slightly, "were never yours to manage without me." I finished. There was no accusation in my tone, no need for it. The facts were enough. She exhaled, longer this time, and for a brief moment, I saw something beneath the composure she had been holding on to. Not anger, not even frustration, something closer to recognition. "Daniel never told me any of this," she said. I considered that carefully before responding. "He told me what I needed to know," I said, "and he prepared the rest." That was the truth of it. Not secrecy, not deception, just preparation, done quietly, without spectacle. Ashley looked down again at the document, then back at me, her posture shifting in a way that suggested she was beginning to understand the position she was actually in. "So what happens now?" she asked. The question was different this time. Not demanding, not assuming, simply asking. I folded my hands together, resting them lightly on my knee, and allowed myself a moment before answering. "Now," I said, "we move forward based on what is already in place." She waited, her attention fixed on me, no longer dismissive, no longer certain. "You will continue living here," I continued, my voice even. "For now, nothing changes immediately." Her expression flickered with something like relief, but it was brief, because I had not finished. "But decisions regarding this house, these accounts, and anything connected to them will go through me." The words were simple, direct, not raised, not softened, just stated. She nodded slowly, the movement measured, as if she were adjusting to a new balance she had not expected to accept. "And if I do not agree?" she asked, though the question lacked the challenge it once would have carried. I met her gaze steadily. "Then nothing moves forward," I said. "That is how it is structured." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was defined, clear in a way that left no room for negotiation disguised as conversation. After a moment, she looked away, her eyes settling somewhere beyond me, perhaps at a version of the future she had imagined that no longer aligned with reality. I did not press further. I did not need to. I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket with a small, habitual motion, and reached for the folder, closing it with quiet precision. Ashley remained seated, her posture still, her thoughts no longer hidden behind certainty. I paused briefly before turning toward the door, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement. "I will be in touch," I said. She nodded once, without speaking. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, not because anything had been undone, but because everything had been placed exactly where it belonged. The driveway, the house, the quiet street beyond it all looked the same. But I did not. And for the first time since I had been told to leave, I understood that I had not lost my place. I had simply reclaimed it.